Are we living in a simulation? People ask this question. Why do people ask this question? Well, the simplest answer to this question is we ask if we are living in a simulation of reality, because we do not fully understand what reality is. Yes? You see how this is the answer that comes before any additional answers may be added to it. Yes? Because if we knew fully and comprehensively what reality is and why it is as it is, then we would just not need to be asking ourselves questions such as, are we living in a simulated reality? There was a time when the scientifically minded offered themselves as a rational alternative to the more intuitive, mystical ways of thinking of the religious. While the religious put their faith in an all-powerful, all-mysterious creator God, those of a more scientific persuasion would extol the virtues of logic and empirical observation. These days, it is not so cut and dry as that. These days, it is quite possible for a scientist to believe not in a spiritual superbeing who has created us and our world, but a computer programming superbeing who has created us and our world. What is up with this? Why do we humans find ourselves gravitating towards this idea that there is somebody out there who is bigger and better than us, and who is somehow invested in our activities while not being willing to come forth and account for themselves? We humans are highly complex beings, and we tend to think about ourselves and existence in general in highly complex, overly complex ways. My work is all about addressing this problem of us trying to tackle the highly complex before we have got the very simplest things correct. You see, it does not work. It does not work. It does not work to try to understand the complex stuff before you have understood the simple stuff that underlies the complex stuff. It does not work for very, very, very simple and obvious reasons. It does not work to try to understand highly complex matters when one has not yet worked out the very simplest truths of those matters. It's pointless. It's a gigantic waste of time. What we have done collectively is failed to understand the very simplest truths of reality, and then declared to ourselves and each other that the very simplest truths of reality cannot be known. This is what we have done. And by this point, we have a long history of doing it. And now just don't know how to stop doing it. Really have no desire to stop doing it. Like children who persuade themselves and each other that they know what they're talking about, and then become overly invested in being one of the ones that the other children look to for guidance. Is there anything I have said so far that is not both fully apparent and understandable? A child is essentially a child until they begin to understand the very simplest truths of reality. And none of us have done this so far, except for myself. This might sound like some big talk from me. How could I possibly know and understand the most simple truths of reality when we have been told again and again that the simplest truths of reality are too simple to be understood by the human mind? There is no such thing as a thing that is too simple to be understood. There is plenty that is too complex to be understood, but there is nothing that is too simple to understand. Explaining that a thing is too simple to be understood is only the kind of thing that a slightly older child will say to a slightly younger child. And the only reason they will get away with saying it is because they are both children. There is no such thing as something that is too simple to be understood. That just makes no sense whatsoever. Please allow me to illustrate. So, I'm going to make a statement now that if you are familiar with my work, you may well be sick of hearing me say. I'm sorry, I can't help that. This statement is at one and the same time effectively the most controversial statement that can be made to human culture, and so simple and obviously true that those who hear me say it can't think of it as being controversial. That in itself is a totally weird thing, don't you think? I want you to pay attention to your own responses to this statement and my explanation of it. I want you to watch yourself, observe yourself, and the way in which you personally respond to what I describe next. The very simplest and most underlying truth of existence is that there are truths that cannot not be true. When I say here that these truths cannot not be true, what I'm saying is that there are truths that are literally existentially incapable of not being true at any time, in any place whatsoever. It's just flat out impossible for them to ever not be true. These are the truths that are allegedly too simple for us humans to comprehend. Now, the reason this statement is controversial is because it breaks all of human culture. Not just some of it, all of it. And who is going to thank me for breaking human culture? The breaking of human culture is what we and this world we live in would benefit from above all other things. Human culture is absolutely hideous. But who is going to thank me for it? The strange statement of mine that is devastatingly controversial, yet still manages to come across as a simple and innocuous enough thing for a person to say, simple and innocuous enough to be just plain old ignored and passed over, breaks religious belief completely and utterly. Because once this statement is accepted for the truth that it is, we understand that all of existence is a result of truths that cannot stop being true anywhere at any time, not the result of God. This strange statement of mine breaks scientific explanations for existence completely and utterly, because all scientific explanations for existence are reverse engineered from empirical observation, and empirical observation alone. Empirical observation of the highly complex, in conjunction with mathematical models that have no identified foundation. So my strange statement, which doesn't seem like that much of a controversial thing to say really, devastates human culture the moment it is listened to and taken seriously. And this is ever such a strange thing, because whatever God you may or may not believe in could only possibly be a result of truths that cannot not be true. And whatever scientific theory for the presence of existence you may or may not subscribe to could only possibly be the result of truths that cannot not be true. The moment you start to try to explain how there are no truths that cannot not be true, that explain the existence of your God, you are effectively saying there is no truth to your God. The moment you start to try to explain how there are no truths that cannot not be true that result in your scientific theory, you are effectively saying there is no truth to your scientific theory. There are truths that cannot not be true is the truth that comes before all other truths. And human culture does not tolerate this truth. Can you perhaps just take a moment to fully absorb the simple truth of what I'm saying here? Because it devastates all of human culture. It really does. Which is a profoundly good thing for all of us. And it is true. And yet, I observe repeatedly, over and over again, how human culture has rendered so very many of you entirely immune to the simple truth of it and the implications it has for all of us. I observed this over and over again. And I want you to see if you are observing this about yourself right now. I identify the very simplest of these truths that cannot not be true and explore their effects in other videos. If you haven't seen them, well, you really should. This video is about the issue of human culture gravitating towards the idea that some character who is bigger, better, and more powerful than us is responsible for us, whether this character be God or some otherworldly computer programmer who decided to create us as a simulation of living sentient beings. Why do we do this? Why should this come about for us? When one does not understand the very simplest truths of reality, one has little to no choice other than to live in one's own best idea of what reality is. Seriously, what else is one going to do? In this case, the reality you think you are most likely living in becomes your simulation of reality. Living in your own simulation of reality does not mean you have been taken out of actual reality and placed in a simulation. It means that you are still in actual reality, because it is utterly impossible for anybody or anything to be taken out of actual reality. But within actual reality, you are living your life according to the idea that you are living in the idea of reality you most identify with, whether it is one you thought up for yourself or one that was handed down to you by someone else. And so it is that the people of this world are living in a simulation of their own devising, while not really living in a simulation at all. And this simulation that we have all come up with between us, this simulation that is all of our individual and contradictory simulations combined, it is called human culture. And it is just such a fucking awful thing for us. It's so awful for us, so miserable for us. Even those of us who believe we are doing relatively well in this life compared to others are confused, depressed, and struggling. And that's the ones of us who think we're doing quite well. How many of us find this place to be literally hellish? How many? How many I'm asking you, how many of us feel like we're in hell here? What's the number, the actual number of people who are suffering and suffering and suffering, yet still afraid to die? I'm asking you. It's the whole world. It's all of us. There are varying degrees of intensity to it, but we are all subject to it. And it can always potentially become more intense for us as an individual and as a collective. And all because we became overly invested in our complex and complicated ideas of what reality is, rather than bringing ourselves to understand the very simplest, truest, and most easy to understand things about what reality is and why it keeps happening to us.